right, so utilitarianism. This was introduced, these last two pop culture readings kind of included both utilitarianism and deontology. So there's a utilitarian answer. We learned in the Joker reading, that deontologists are going to have a hard time killing Joker just because it would save many more lives. But if you're a utilitarian, it's a no-brainer. He's got to go, right, to save all those other lives. So you get an example in today's reading from The Watchmen, in the movie, and in the comic. Veidt, who's also Ozymandias, a superhero who's the smartest man in the world, has a plan for world peace, right? And so he says, the comedian was right. Humanity's savage nature will inevitably lead to global annihilation. That sounds like a bad outcome or result, right? So in order to save the planet, I had to trick it with the greatest practical joke in human history. And one of the other superheroes says, by killing millions, and he said, to save billions, a necessary crime, right? So it's calculating, looking into the future and evaluating outcomes, positive or negatives. More happiness, more harm. We're trying to minimize happiness and maximize happiness, minimize harm for the most number of people. So it's not about my happiness, that would be egoism, right? It's about everybody's happiness, including mine. But, if it turns out that I'm the a-hole and killing me would make everybody else a lot happier, then I got to go, right? That's the way it is. So you see a crude version of utilitarianism in Ozymandias' plan. He, tricks society into believing that there's been a nuclear attack and blame it on Dr. Manhattan to unite everybody around that. At the end, just to spoil a little bit, somebody threatens to let the cat out of the bag, and they're worried that it will undermine world peace that's just been achieved. Right? In Rick and Morty, if you've seen the autoerotic assimilation episode where we see one of Rick's old girlfriends that has this power of assimilation, right? She gives a basic utilitarian idea as well as her moral justification for assimilating the members of this planet. So we get Unity, and one person says, Summer, before I took over this planet, this man was a registered sex offender. And Summer says, yeah, well, so what? At least he was himself. This woman was a drug addict on the verge of suicide. Now she's a marine biologist. Morty says, listen, Unity, I don't think it's my sister's trying to say that life would be perfect without you. I just think she's saying life would be, life. And then another version of Unity in the hive mind says, I transformed life here into a paradise. Prostitutes are now scientists. The homeless are now philosophers, right? So outcomes, right? So she justified assimilating everybody into this hive mind, eliminating their individuality so they're just performing a function in society to make it all go better. Right? Again, appealing to a consequentialist teleological notion there. And then we've already looked at the trolley problem a little bit. So at least on one version of the trolley problem, it's pretty clear you got to switch the track so that one dies to save the other five. Right? Deontologists have a bit of an issue there, but the utilitarians, it's just it's a numbers game, right? So key ideas here: consequentialism, teleology, telos. Again, ends, outcomes, goals. Objectives in the sense of like a goal, right? So it's a teleological theory, but it's also a consequentialist theory. In deontology, what feature of an action or what related idea, maybe I should say it that way, are we evaluating? What's the first step in the universalizability test in deontology? Identify the maxim, which is a part of it's the goal for which you are acting, right? So that's got to be in there, but it's also the action that you're taking, right? And then we see if that can be universalized or not, right? If it generates a contradiction when we try to universalize it, then we end up with the problem, right? So if I say that, look, empathy is the problem in Western society, don't be empathetic, right? It's going to come around where I might need some empathy, right? But I will have robbed myself of it. So we end up with one of those problems with imperfect duties there that we covered last time with Kant. Utilitarianism is probably, it is the most worked out version of consequentialism that we have. And so it's consequentialist. It says what's most important about the action is not the maxim that's being acted on or the agent's intent, but the outcomes, the foreseeable consequences of that action. Or following a rule that guides the action. We're going to have a couple different versions of utilitarianism to work out. So it's not about maxims and figuring out whether they can be universalized or not. It's about looking into the future and trying to calculate what are the foreseeable consequences of A versus B or the other options, and trying to calculate which one of those is going to bring about the most amount of happiness or at least minimize the most harm, so we at least avoid that one. So the key idea here is maximizing utility, bringing about the greatest ratio of pleasure or desire satisfaction, depending on the version of utilitarianism, possible given the circumstances over the long run, right? We're trying to not be short-sighted about it. It's foreseeable consequences over the long run. What makes things go best long term? Utilitarianism is an old idea, but it really gets going in the 19th century, at least in Western philosophy, with these two guys, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Later in the semester, we're going to have another guy that we encounter called Charles Mills with an S, but John Stuart Mill is a utilitarian. Charles Mills is a different kind of moral theorist. We'll learn about him in the alternative approaches section. So Bentham here, British guy, and he argued it is the greatest good to the greatest number of people, which is the measure of right and wrong. So there's his normative or prescriptive standard, right? Golden rule tells us to treat others as you would want to be treated. So if you don't like getting punched in the face randomly by strangers, you're supposed to refrain from punching strangers in the face, which is another way of saying that it's morally what? Yeah, impermissible. Get back to one of our vocabulary words, right? Impermissible or prohibited. We're obligated, according to utilitarianism, to do the action that maximizes overall happiness. So instead of seeing whether whether it passes that universalizability test and generates an internal contradiction, here we're looking at the outcomes, right? Looking at the outcomes. So again, it's a key reason why both of those theories are mentioned in those two readings, because they're foils for each other in a lot of ways, right? So Bentham mentions, he's a classical utilitarian, which is what I'm going to be talking about the most. Contemporary utilitarians do a little bit something different, but both Bentham and Mill are pleasure is intrinsically good, right? Pleasure is intrinsically good. So what's an intrinsic good? It's good in and of itself, not because of any other thing, right? So happiness, pleasure here, and he's going to expand the definition of pleasure a little bit. Intrinsically good, so we want more of that, and we want to minimize the thing that's intrinsically bad, pain and suffering for harm. So he says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is them for alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do and all we say and all we think. So Bentham, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Bentham, but I will mention his little argument here. He has, sometimes they call it the elimination argument because he's getting rid of other options. But he really only lists three. Asceticism, sympathy, and antipathy, which is like kind of a Humean standpoint, would be a sentimentalist view based on whether you approve or disapprove of the conduct, or utility, which is of course going to be his preferred standard, right? He says morality is not based on asceticism. It's good for your personal private life, but it's not good as a guide for social intercourse, as he says it. So if you want to, adopt really strict vegetarian diets for your own self, that's great, but everybody else isn't required to do that. Right? Or if you want to engage in certain religious practices, you can do that, so long as you're not harming anybody else, right? Or at least it's not generating more harm. So that's too personal. It's good for the private sphere, but not for social intercourse. Then he rejects sympathy and antipathy because they're, going to be relativistic, right? So if it's not going to work if you're trying to establish a universalist and objective moral theory then. So by eliminating those two, again, he points out that utility wins, right? So that's his little argument there. So he said a little bit on asceticism then. He says, we read of saints for the good of their souls and the mortification of their bodies, have voluntarily yielded themselves to prey to vermin. But though persons of this class have wielded the reins of empire, we read of none who have set themselves to work and made laws on purpose. The book that this is coming from is called The Principles of Morality and Legislation, right? At least for the Bentham's book. So it's talking few body politics, the breed of highwaymen, housebreakers, or incendiaries. So again, good for private life, but not to govern social intercourse. And when we're figuring out what the right thing to do is, it gets pretty complicated pretty quick. Bentham says that we got to take into account these 7 features of the action. So your algorithm to do this very conscientiously is going to look pretty complicated here, right? So first, how strong is the pleasure, its intensity? 6, how long does that pleasure last? So its duration. How likely is it that the pleasure will actually occur, right? And then, will that pleasure be satisfied or occur sooner or later? So is it remote or is it more immediate? You've probably heard people, as you've entered adult life, tell you there's no immediate gratification here, right? This sort of thing. Fecundity, how likely is it that the experience will be followed of sensations of the same type? So is that pleasure going to lead to more pleasures, right? Like a runner's high, you get pleasure and then you keep doing it, and then you get health benefits from it, right? So it keeps going, as long as you don't stub your toe. Alcohol, on the other hand, drink too much of it and it's followed by the opposite sensation. And then the extent, how many people will be affected by the action, right? So 7 elements or features of an action that Bentham says we need to take into account in order to figure out what the right thing to do is. Then we get to Mill. He's who we're going to use as our main example. And I'm going to, just like I did with deontology, I'm going to simplify our utilitarianism for introduction purposes. So utilitarianism, this is John Stuart Mill. It's a really short book, actually, from 1863. Influenced a lot of Western philosophy. He used utilitarianism to argue for classical liberalism, so limited governments with respect for individual rights and these sorts of things. Used a version of it to argue for more in line with free markets than with centralized control markets and economies even. And here's Mill on the greatest happiness or the utility principle. So egoism, ethical egoism, right conduct is defined by what's in my rational, enlightened self-interest. Social contract theory, I have to abide by those agreements that all self-interested individuals have agreed to as a manner of picking the terms in which we're going to interact with one another, right? And it's got to achieve peace, right? So there's the teleology of social contract. It's to achieve order and peace, not chaos, right? And then in deontology, we have the categorical imperative, right? An imperative, an obligation that's binding on everybody categorically, right? And then for Mill and the utilitarians, we got the greatest happiness principle or the utility principle, right? So here's the basic standard, but there's really a lot smashed into this passage here. So he says, the creed which accepts the foundation of morals, utility or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. We're mostly going to be dealing with classical utilitarians, and so they're the hedonist version of this. Some more contemporary folks don't worry about hedonism so much as they worry about like preference satisfaction. That's easier to measure because you can just vote. So this being said, according to the utilitarian opinion, the end, there's that teleology, of human action is necessarily also the standard of morality, which may be accordingly be defined the rules and precepts for human conduct by the observation to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not only to them, but so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. So in Kant, in deontology, what had an intrinsic value? There are kind of 2 candidates that you could use here. It had to do with his idea of moral personhood, so that might give you a point. What was the property for moral consideration in Kantianism? If you were what kind of being? Rational being, right? So I got a cat at home. I'm pretty sure on any definition of rationality that my cat does not have it. There may be some means-end reasoning going on there, but for the most part, it doesn't seem like conscious reasoning. It seems for the most part like he's acting on instinct, right, and drives that maybe he is cognitively unaware of himself, right? But according to Mill here, I've got obligations to that cat because it can experience pleasure or pain. So that's a big difference than Kant, where it was just rationality that mattered. There are things that have rationality and sentience, right? And there are sentient things that don't have rationality, like non-human animals. Maybe apes we might have to worry about, also dolphins and some stuff there. But here the criteria isn't rationality, it's lower than that. The threshold for being a member of the moral community is just having the capacity to experience pleasure or pain. So it's a big contrast there with Kant. So we've already got a couple here. First, the teleology and consequentialism are a big contrast with deontology, and the criteria for moral standing is different as well. It's much more expansive. So the deontologists, they're going to have a harder time getting an argument for like vegetarianism or veganism off the ground, but the utilitarians, it's built right in almost, right? Because I've got to worry about, how many units of pleasure or pain are created when I charbroil that pig to eat, right? I ate a lot of burgers. Not good, according to these folks, right? It's like the Holocaust in a display cabinet in the grocery store if you're a utilitarian. And I'm just like, yeah, give me a pound of that. Right, so another way of putting that greatest happiness or utility principle, and y'all probably seen the Purge movies, right? Based on a crude utilitarian idea. We're going to go nuts for, 12 or 24 hours? 24, y'all better hope they don't do that, because it's not good. Right? Because over the long run, so we get to have this catharsis, right? For 24 hours, right? Get to kill anybody. Because it makes everything else go better if we do that once a year. So there's the Purge movies. There's the Purge episode of Rick and Morty, where Rick finally gets a little disturbed by Morty's over-enthusiastic purging. So it's one place where Rick starts to look like he does have genuine moral concern for some of his family members there. So again, just another shorter way of putting that utility principle. So among the foreseeable consequences, of which there could be many possible actions, right? One ought to always bring about the greatest good for the greatest number over the long run. There are a lot of things that would make a lot of people happy if I did them right now, but over the long run would not make people very happy. Like if I just gave A's out. You'd all feel really good right now. Your prospective employers would be pissed. And you would be pissed later on when you pay that student loan back, but you don't know anything. So it's over the long run. So applying utilitarianism, we can think of this as a spectrum more of a spectrum here, right? So obligations, things that I'm morally required to do, whatever action has the foreseeable consequences of making everybody else off better, right? That's an obligation. So remember in Kant, I only have an imperfect duty to contribute to other people's happiness, but here it's driving, I got a big obligation to worry about other people's happiness as well. Right? Happiness doesn't really play much of a role in Kantianism at all. So things that are going to have the foreseeable consequences of bringing about more harm or pain, those things are impermissible. And the stuff that's closer to a dead heat, right, or negligible in terms of their intensity, are going to be permissible actions. So we can think of it again in a very oversimplified way. You had a question, Matt? Let's say that we only have two options. Usually there are many more options, so you have to calculate the foreseeable utility of each one of those possibilities, right? So if we got two actions, and action A has the foreseeable consequences of having 4 units of happiness but 2 units of pain, then the expected utility is 2. Action B, again, assuming just we have these and only these 2 options, 6 units of happiness, 2 units of pain, so 4 total expected utility. So what am I obligated to do? Action B, right? Action B. So think of it this way. You've probably heard, we've done murder at the door scenarios with promise making before, right? So suppose you're in Nazi Germany, 1933. You're a citizen, right? And the SS comes knocking on the door. and they want to know if you're hiding any Jews in your basement, right? The Kantian has an issue with lying. He's got to worry about he's got to hope that Nazi is going to perform the universalizability tests rather than him imposing on it. Although there is a little bit of a workaround there. But for the utilitarian, man, lie to that guy, right? Lie to him. But again, it's going to be all of those possible courses of action, right? So you might ask yourself, like, look, shouldn't we go back in time and kill baby Hitler, right? So that we save all those millions of people. So higher and lower pleasures. Again, pleasure is Mill's notion of happiness. That's going to be important to distinguish Mill's sense of happiness, which again is pleasure, from Aristotle's, which is coming up next, which is eudaimonia. Mill is thinking about happiness as pleasure much more like we would in the contemporary world. Aristotle's a little bit different, so I'll have to worry about that when we get there. So Mill continues on in his book. He says, it's quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, that the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. What Mill's doing here is challenging Bentham's earlier version of utilitarianism. Let's call it the pig philosophy objection. According to Mill, he's looking at Bentham's theory and he says, look, according to Bentham's version of this theory, you'd be better off if you were a happy pig rather than a depressed Socrates. So it would be better, he's claiming on Bentham's version of the theory, that you'd be better off as a happy pig rather than as a depressed Socrates. What kinds of happiness is a pig capable of? It's going to be very limited, right? Play, copulation, full belly. Some kind of social intercourse, right? What kinds of pleasures is Socrates capable of? Knowledge. He can appreciate all sorts of abstract concepts, right? So Mills says that's a weird implication of your theory. Something's got to be wrong with it if it implies, at least logically, that we would be better off being happy animals rather than depressed Socrates, right? So he points out that the reason why that's an implication of Bentham's theory is because he's only taking into account the quantity of the pleasure and not the quality of the pleasure. So Mill introduces this distinction between higher, lower, and lower pleasures. And lower pleasures he associates more with bodily pleasures, right? And higher pleasures with like more intellectual pleasures. So it is stretching the notion of pleasure a little bit there, right? So it's quite compatible, he says, that we distinguish those two, right? So it could still, he's revising and developing that earlier theory a little bit, the way we saw Bergeron and Trammell try to revise and develop Kant's theory a little bit in that last little reading on deontology. So how are we going to decide which of these two pleasures is higher or lower, which one's more valuable? Well, we need people who have experience with both. So he says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all have experience of both, give decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that's the more desirable one. So if you want to figure out, just to use a trivial, silly little example, whether drinking double juicifers from gnarly barley or drinking a PBR is going to bring about more happiness in the world, you need a beer connoisseur.
No, you don't.
Have the same effects, but the aesthetic pleasures are different. Also, the health benefits. Right? One of those has corn syrup in it, and one of them doesn't. I don't think juice has corn syrup in it. So, again, men often from infirmity of character, however. So he does mention character a little bit in here. But he says men often from infirmity of character, weakness of character, make their election for the near good, though they know it to be less desirable, less valuable. And this is no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between a bodily and a mental pleasure. They pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. You probably know somebody that's drinking too much. It's bad, could be bad for their health, right? So you can drink, but you can't do it till starts bringing about more harms for everybody, yourself included, right, than pleasures. So we're gonna, it's almost like a democratic way of trying to decide which one's a higher and lower one based on, experience and reporting of like were you happier or sad or preference satisfaction, right, that kind of thing. So he says, whose happiness, right? Are we he's again distinguishing it from egoism. I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of right conduct is not the agent's own happiness, that'd be egoism, right? But of all concerned. And what he means by all concerned are all of those who can be affected by the action. And this could be really, really remote. During lunch today, I got a bag of chips, and this is not lunch. It's a bag of chips and a candy bar because I was pressed for time. But that is that's like $4 that I didn't donate to a charity, right? So, do I need designer jeans or do I just need a pair of good enough jeans and then donate the rest to make the world a better place? Right? Those are the sorts of calculations you got to start to worry about. So he mentions here, it's not the agent's own happiness, but of all that concerned. And remember, one of the two ingredients of utilitarianism that you read about for today is egalitarianism, right? So that means everybody's pleasure and pain counts equally. Doesn't matter if you're a criminal or an innocent little kid, your units of pain get counted the same, right? So he says, between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. It's a math problem and my feelings don't get to come into it. But that also means that according to utilitarianism, if I'm faced with the choice between saving the life of my own mother and let's say that I like her versus 10 strangers, what do I got to do?
For your mom.
Mom's got to go. I got to save the 10. The fact that I have a partial relationship with her does not get to enter into it because then it's just going to slide into relativism and what makes you happiest, not what makes everybody else happy too. So you've got to forego a lot of personal relationships and calculate it impartially. Otherwise, you're going to get charged with relativism or subjectivism or arbitrariness, moral equivalence, all of those sorts of things that we got to worry about. So again, utilitarianism, big defense of both a form of moral, political, and legal rights here. How are they going to justify something like universal human rights? So if you're a deontologist, this is much easier. They're the sorts of things that you shouldn't do to others to use them as mere means, right? So you got to respect their freedom and their autonomy. How are utilitarians going to try and justify rights?
So I have a question. So for that same example, what if it was 5 murders that were on death trial?
Doesn't matter.
They would say save the people that
You got to go with the number of units, not whether you like them or dislike them. Now utilitarians have a view of punishment that is it's not. So there are kind of two views of punishment, two basic views, let's say. The first one is like Kantianism. It's called retributivism. That says you got to get punished because what you did was wrong. It's about the inherent nature of the action that you performed. Utilitarians, they've got a deterrence model. We want to make sure other people aren't running around killing people, so we're going to lock you up. But it's about maximizing overall happiness, right? So the punishment isn't because you did a thing that's inherently wrong. It's you did a thing that if a bunch of other people did it, it would bring about more harm than good. So it's a deterrence. Yeah.
But based on what he said, you said you have to look forward, right?
You got a forward looking, yeah.
If you see if people that we're saving are gonna die soon, and you think into the future, if they're gonna die tomorrow, then next week we'll have 1 alive mother and 5 dead people.
Yeah. So
if you kill the mom now, you have 6 dead people next week. You know what I'm saying?
yeah. So then you have to triage.
What's that triage?
Triage, when you have limited resources, medical resources, and more people than you can save. Y'all know how they do this? It's a utilitarian calculation. I forget the 3. Is it 3 categories? It's like people that are about to die, so you don't waste your time on them. Mm-hmm. People that are severely wounded but could be saved, so you spend your time on them, and the people that aren't hurt so bad get help last.
Oh, okay.
Right. So utilitarianism, it seems like cutting in line, that problem looks like it's built for deontology to answer, right? all these things about like limited resources and how to maximize their usefulness or their utility looks like it's built for utilitarianism, right? So if you're in the military, it's very common to say, yeah, look, this one brigade's going to go over here and flank and draw fire, and they're going to get pounded and probably lose most of them, but we're going to send everybody else behind them and we're going to win the war. Now, there's a little bit of an issue because there you're dividing up people between us and them in a way that the utilitarian still has to worry about and find problematic, because you still can't do certain things to people in war, even if it would expedite the war, because you could, like torture, right? You don't want to set a precedent. So if somebody sees me pouring my oil from my car down the drain in Louisiana, right? It's not that big of a deal if everybody pours. So if everybody sees me doing that and says, oh, that's a good idea, now I've set a precedent and everybody else, my actions have really bad consequences, right? So you got to worry about those sorts of things too. So when I say I'm oversimplifying that calculation a little bit, that's what I'm getting at, because you got to worry about a lot of nuances in there, absolutely. So yeah, you got to worry about that. So again, the punishment one I think feels like a good one. Kant would say you got to get punished because murder is inherently wrong. And the utilitarians are going to say, you got to get punished because we don't want more people running around punishing. So we got to lock you up and set an example of you, so other people will be, deterred from doing that. So to have a right then is appealing to the principle of utility here, is, as I conceive, to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. If the objector goes on to ask why it ought, I can give him no other reason than general utility. Justice, then, is a name for certain moral requirements, obligations, which regarded collectively stand higher on the scale of social utility, and are therefore more paramount obligation than others. Though particular cases may arise in which some other social duty is so important as to overrule any one of the general maxims of justice. Like general maxims of justice are going to be like, de jure, things like stuff that we have made like common law rather than unofficial norms. So though particular cases may occur in which some other social duty is so important as to overrule any one of the general maxims of justice. Thus, to save a life, it may not only be allowable, but a duty to steal or take by force the necessary food or medicine, or to kidnap and compel to officiate the only qualified medical practitioner. Normally, and let's pretend that people around here are good drivers, what are you supposed to do at a four-way stop? Stop, right? But if it's 1 a.m., there are no oncoming traffic, and I got my wife who needs to get to the emergency room, I'm probably going to run that light so long as there's not any possible foreseeable bad consequences of me running it, right, to get her there faster. So that's what he means there. So Mill gave a robust defense, I mentioned, of classical liberalism. As a part of that, he gave a right to free speech. And he said, you get the right to free speech, but there are limits to that. How are we going to justify those limits? Harms. So you probably heard this line. You get free speech, but you don't have the right to walk into a crowded movie theater and falsely yell fire. How come? Because the consequences of doing that look like more panic and potential harm than of not doing it. Right? So distributive justice. How are we going to distribute the opportunities, burdens, and rewards of society? Should we have a completely privatized school system where everybody's got to pay private school tuition in order to get an education, or are we going to take some tax dollars from other people and redistribute that to make higher education affordable for more people in society? Which one of those is going to lead to better outcomes? Right? You see how the argument could go there. So if a duty to do to each according to his deserts, returning good for good as well repressing evil by evil, it necessarily follows that we should treat all equally well, who have deserved equally well and deserved equally well of it. That is, who deserved equally well absolutely. Remember when we were looking at egoism, Rachel's criticism of egoism that he thought was the closest to a refutation of it was that it divided the world up between us and them and put more priority on my interests than other interests, and said that that violates the principle that you should treat equals equally, right? And we see that kind of equal principle of equal treatment popping up here again. So this is the highest abstract standard of social and distributive justices towards which all institutions and efforts of virtuous citizens should be made in the utmost possible degree to converge. But this great moral duty rests still upon a deeper foundation, being a direct emanation from the first principles of morals and not a mere logical corollary from secondary or derivative doctrines. It's involved in the very meaning of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. So you get lots and lots of individual freedom to do what you want, especially in your private life where it's not affecting anybody else at all or very much. But you're restricted from doing stuff that is going to have the foreseeable consequences of having way more harm than bringing about happiness. So the proof of utility, what's his argument for that? There's a lot of scholarly debate over whether this proof is fallacious or not. I don't exactly think it is, but the way it's written is a little goofy. So he says, the only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that that a sound is audible is that people actually hear it. And so of the other sources of our experience. In a like manner, I apprehend that the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually do desire it. So people think that sometimes that could look circular a little bit. So that's kind of one of the charges that people worry about there. So if the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, no one would ever convince any person that it was so. But if you go back to Bentham, nature placed us under these sovereign masters of pleasure and pain. See how he's building still on that. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable except that each person, so far as he believes it to be obtainable, desires his own happiness, and that means other people desire what? Their own happiness. So what's the standard? Overall happiness, right? So this is the only proof that is really possible to give. That each person's happiness is a good to that person, and a general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. Happiness has made itself out as one of the ends of conduct. There's that teleology again, and consequently, one of the criteria of morality. He's got a second principle. I've mentioned it a few times here, so I'll end here. So we got the utility principle. In Kantianism, the categorical imperative both tells us what our obligations are and what's impermissible. So it functions as a liberty-limiting principle, right? So one of the things we're always doing is, we get freedom, but what are the limits on that, right? So you see, even the egoist and the social contractarians were worried about that as well. Kant's worried about it. Here's Mill's answer to it. But he kind of has the secondary principle, the harm principle. So it says, the principle that is the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any other member is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can rightly be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will. So we still got consent in here. Giving people consent tends to make them happier than forcing them to do stuff, right? So is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. He cannot rightly be compelled to do or to forbear because it would be better for him to do so, because it would make him happier, because in the opinions of others to do so would be wise or even right. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. But again, that could be remote because the money that I spent on my chips, I didn't donate to Oxfam to alleviate. It's really cheap to give like an African village a donkey and lift that village out of poverty, because they can use it for the milk after it's too old for milk, and for meat, then the skin. So it's like giving just a few goats to some of these villagers can really help. So his own good can't do it. So the only part of conduct for which anyone is amenable to society is that impacts others, either negatively or positively. So in the part which merely concerns himself, so here's that really robust public-private distinction that they got here, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So let me mention a applied ethics issue here to kind of illustrate the difference between Kantianism and utilitarianism here. If I'm looking into the future and I see that my future promises very clearly to be filled with much more torment than happiness, it looks like I can kill myself. But for Kant, I can't kill myself out of self-love because self-love is supposed to keep me going. There's a contradiction in there. So very different attitudes about suicide there. You have to worry about how sad your mom's going to be, right, or something like that, but that's not killing her. Right? So you're going to get different things on promise breaking, truth telling. I got to keep my promises generally, but, you know, if lying to the Nazi at the door helps save more lives, then I'm required to lie, right? So what you get here between these two theories, and again, it's just a very big point of difference, I'll end on this, is that according to utilitarianism, no actions are inherently right or wrong. They're only right or wrong given the context in which they will either maximize happiness or minimize pain. But for deontology, there are some things that you're not supposed to do regardless of the consequences, even if it makes everybody else happy. So they think that there's some actions that are inherently wrong or right versus ones that are just a means to an end. All right, so we'll end there.